Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. We all know that politics can divide families. The partisan divide during the long lead up to the Civil War was no exception, as the McKim family of Baltimore is a case in point. John McKim, a Baltimorean by birth, and his wife Catherine, a native Virginian, had Southern sympathies, but they remained Union loyal. Their son, pictured here, Randolph Harrison McKim, a student at the University of Virginia, cast his lot with the fledgling Confederate nation. I want to share a letter that he wrote telling his mother, his mama, of his decision in 1861. That letter was published in McKim's 1910 memoirs, A Soldier's Recollections. Before I read the letter, it contains two references that need a little bit of explaining to give you some context. First, in the months before the war began, the months before Fort Sumter, he joined many of his fellow students at the University of Virginia and joined a militia company called the Southern Guard. Just a couple weeks after Fort Sumter, McKim and the rest of the company and another student company called the Sons of Liberty joined Stonewall Jackson's command in Harper's Ferry. That was the end of April of 1861. The two student companies only remained in Harper's Ferry for a few weeks before being sent back to the University of Virginia to resume their studies. Now, McKim, instead of going back to University of Virginia, he made a detour through Baltimore to visit his parents. At this point, it was probably late May of 1861, and he had not yet formally enlisted in the Confederate Army, but it was pretty clear that he had made up his mind, though he had not yet told his parents. He did tell them he was thinking about it. He describes the visit to his mom and dad at the family's Baltimore home, which is called Belvedere. And so here's what he has to say about that visit, which occurred probably late May, maybe early June of 1861. He says, quote, "While in Baltimore at dear old Belvedere, the beautiful home of my childhood and boyhood, I had to endure the pain of my father's displeasure because of my espousal of the Southern cause. He himself had been in warm personal sympathy with the South, but through the strong intellectual influence of a near relative, his political sympathy had been turned to the North. His heart was with my mother's people. Remember, she was a Virginian, but his head turned him to the side of the Union. The old battle of head and heart. I mention it," McKim continues, "because this difference was by reason of our great mutual attachment, very painful to us both. In an interview between us, when he had expressed himself in severe condemnation of my course, I turned and said with much feeling, 'Well, Father, I comfort myself with the promise, when my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up.' And so we parted," end quote. McKim headed back to Virginia, and in July 1861, he joined the Confederate 1st Maryland Infantry. Here's the letter. Now he's telling his mother and his father that he's now a soldier. He writes the letter, addresses it to his mother. He doesn't address it to his dad because he knows of his father's displeasure. So here's that letter. It's date lined Winchester, Virginia, July 11th, 1861. My dear mother, I left the university last week expecting to be in Baltimore before now, but on my way, I heard of the declaring of martial law and of the unlimbering of artillery in the public squares of our city. This was more than my endurance could stand, and I determined to come up here and join Willie Murray's company and aid in driving those insolent oppressors out of our city. I feel this to be my duty, and I earnestly hope it will not be displeasing to either you or Papa. I cannot but hope and trust that Papa has before this awakened to a sense of the despotism which Lincoln is building up for himself, and that he is as desirous as I am to drive every Northerner from the state of Maryland. I would go home if I could and try to get his and your consent to my present course, but they are so strict now that I fear they would arrest me for having been to Harper's Ferry, as there are so many informers nowadays. I'm very sorry not to see you once more before joining, but it is impossible. I hope I may be among those who before long shall march into Baltimore and deliver her from her oppressors. Poor Baltimore! My heart bleeds for her. Bob McKim, a relative, has come up here and joined a Virginia artillery company. Duncan, another family friend, is in the same company I am in. He is a splendid soldier and very enthusiastic. You need not be alarmed about me, my dear mother. There is some danger in case of battle, but very little. The Yankees cannot shoot. But, dear Mamma, if anything should happen to me, remember that your son is not afraid to die for the liberties of his country, that he scorns being a Tory, and that he can look up to heaven and ask a blessing upon the cause he is engaged in, and commit his soul to God on the battlefield, and then fear not the sting of death or the victory of the grave. So, what became of McKim? He served in the 1st Maryland for a little while, and then he left to serve on the staffs as an officer of Stonewall Jackson, the man he was with in Harper's Ferry in May 1861, and after Jackson's death, a Maryland General, George H. Stuart. McKim ended the war as chaplain of the 2nd Virginia Cavalry. He survived it all and became a prominent minister and a strong supporter of the lost cause narrative, and wrote often and preached often on the deification of his personal Christian hero, General Robert E. Lee. McKim would never see his father again. John McKim died in January 1865. McKim described his father as, quote, a noble and high-minded man was he, and particularly devoted to me. Nothing but the strongest conviction of duty could have led me to act contrary to his wishes. During the whole war, I constantly sent him messages of love and sometimes wrote to him, end quote. McKim's mother, Catherine, lived until 1898. McKim died in 1920. So there you have the story of Randolph Harrison McKim, the Confederate soldier who left Baltimore to join the army, wrote his mama a letter about enlisting and having a bad break with his papa, who he never saw again. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research